The sky tore like wet canvas, and fire fell out of it. Miners on the night shift stopped their drills and looked up with the kind of reverence born from fear, the kind that keeps you quiet in a storm so the storm forgets your name. Purple lightning veined the cloud deck, vox masts crackled and died. The horizon shrugged as if the world were trying to shake a fever. Then the comet came, a spear of amber light that hit the shale flats outside Habitat 12 and threw a ring of molten glass into the dark. What stood in the smoking crater was not a demon and not a man. Plates retracted across her like tide pulling back from a reef, heat ghosting off the armor until the glow retreated into seams and eyes. The visor was gold and empty as a sun. She lifted a cannon the length of a child and let its hum settle the air around her into obedience. Samus Aran counted her breath without moving. Gravity slightly low. Air fouled with industrial dust and something else. Iron filings slick with oil. Radiation spikes fading. Ship not responding. Stars wrong. The HUD wrote these facts in lean chosoglyphs and waited for orders that did not come, because there were none that covered this. Engines, dozens, rolled into range like a storm of insects. Headlamps scissored the dust, found her and froze, as if the drivers had just hit the animal in the road and were waiting to see if it would stand up. Broad silhouettes resolved into tracked carriers plated in riveted faith. Sigils. Skulls, wings, the Kagan skull of a church that built its gods out of factories. Gun turrets slewed. Men in flak coats scrambled, making the sign of a double-headed bird with hands that shook. Contact, a vox-barked voice shouted. Unknown asset at the crater. Mechanicus authority confirms priority containment. Weapons free on the Inquisitor's word. Samus raised her free hand, palm open. The universal signal for don't. The beam of a floodlight hit her visor and splashed back. Gunners cursed and shaded their eyes. She dialed down the reflection and let the suit etch targets without taking them. There were many. A woman walked between the vehicles as if they were tall, nervous horses. Long black coat, rosetted her throat like a knife hilt, eyes that audited and found things wanting. She stopped at the lip of the crater and looked down without flinching. I am Inquisitor Severine Vorn of the Ordo Xenos, she said, and even the wind seemed to listen for instructions. You will power down and submit to Imperial custody. The word custody fit this place the way a chain fit a wrist. Samus didn't move. The dust tasted like pennies. More engines were closing. Smaller, disciplined, red robes fluttering behind them. The tech priests came singing in machine code, swinging sensors that spilled incense over their rifle barrels as if perfume made bullets polite. Power down, Vorn repeated, almost gentle. The ground responded for Samus. A ripple ran under the shale like a breath taken too late. Floodlights jittered. A miner screamed in a voice that had just remembered childhood. The cracks arrived a heartbeat later, hair-thin at first, then spidering wide until the flats looked like a mirror dropped from a great height. Purple light seeped up from beneath, and hands unfolded where hands had no right to be. No one needed an order. Heavy stubbers thundered. Tracers stitched the dust into whiplashed lines. Things came out of the cracks, sinuous and many-jointed, laughing mouths where elbows should be, blades where language would help. Samus moved without announcing it. The cannon coughed a lattice of plasma that turned a leaping shadow into confetti of steam and ash. She slid, fired again, stacked kills into something rhythmic and useful the way you stack breath when you run. The first big one announced itself with heat. It rose like a cathedral deciding it had changed its mind about burial. A titan of brass and flayed iconography, furnace mouth screaming hymns backward. Chain sensors dragged behind it like comet tails, studded with teeth. Something in Baroque armor rode its back and lifted a sword that cut the air into strips. Samus charged a shot until it turned the barrel white and put it into the engine's chest. Metal flowered outward. Mouths laughed. She dove as a fist fell. The impact churned the crater rim into a black tide of shale. The rider made a gesture like pulling a thorn from a god, and the sky inside the crater turned the wrong color. Her visor blanked, recovered. Warnings wrote themselves and then thought better of it. On the ridge, Vorn had already turned disbelief into logistics. Scutarii anchor. Macro lasers to bearing 09. Artillery 2. Walk the barrage right to left. Mechanicus, bind that thing if you can. Shoot it if you can't. Unknown asset. Samus, she said, mostly to prove she could still decide what to be called. Samus. Keep it busy. Samus obliged. Missiles slotted from her backpack into breeches that had never been meant for this universe and somehow fit anyway. The first super missile knifed into the demon engine's elbow. The second found a seam under a prayer plate. The third sold the lie and exploded behind the teeth. The rider turned to mark her and revealed a triple-faced helm that smiled with 3 different histories. A spear of cool blue lanced in from the shale spires to the east and took the rider through the visor. Runes chased themselves inside the smoke. The body toppled like a statue thrown from a high place. The engine shuddered, remembering physics. Samus traced the beam to a thin figure in leaf-slick armor on the ridge. Tall, wrong by human measures, and calm like an equation solved. Eldar. A seer. The helm dipped as if they were colleagues at a conference on murder. A dropship came down on the convoy's far flank, black as a verdict. Its ramp unrolled with the arrogant dignity of a drawbridge. A man stepped out wearing a cathedral for a suit and a scowl for a face. He carried his helm because his eyes were weapons too and he liked to use all of them. Inquisitor, he said, and his voice did not so much arrive as occupy. Brother Captain Tiber Valens. Black Templars. You called for a sword. I brought an oath. His gaze found Samus and stayed there. Xeno's taint, he concluded. Not shouting but loud enough to be scripture. Human, Vorn answered. Crisp as a blade crossing a whetstone. Augmented and currently saving your transport, Brother Captain. Samus didn't bother with the argument. The engine bucked. She read its joints the way a climber reads a cliff and put bombs where metal had to be. Fists fell, she wasn't there. The cannon barked in short, disciplined bursts. The mouth that sang the wrong way changed key to screaming and then to silence. Valens joined late and only because quitting the battlefield would have been worse than fighting alongside a heresy on legs. His jump pack roared like a choir badly briefed. He landed atop the engine and drove a relic blade into a seam that had just been taught to exist by Samus's bombs. Brass screamed. The monster faltered. Samus shot it through the back of the throat. It stopped being a problem at the same moment it became a hill. The next wave tried to pour through the cracks before they cooled. Vorn's artillery walked fire across the flats in a line that congratulated itself by being straight. Mechanicus chanted binary over servos racked to tearing. The Eldar's stave hummed, writing precise geometry into air that had forgotten the trick. The purple lightning hesitated, as if embarrassed. Asset, Vorn's vox cut through. We have a situation beneath the refinery. Auspec's ghosts matching the artifact you illuminated. If Malphas wants a keyhole, this is where he'll cut it. I need you on that door yesterday. Samus scanned the field, found a path through smoke and burning prayer banners, and ran it. Understood. Valens intercepted at the edge of the crater as if he had been born exactly where she currently needed to be. They studied each other across 2 meters and a war. He had a face that looked carved with tools not designed for kindness. If you betray the Inquisitor or this world, he said, I will kill you so completely your name forgets it was yours. And if I don't? Samus asked. Then I will reconsider your execution, he said, and it was almost a joke. Almost. I appreciate your flexibility, she said, and vaulted past him, because the ground had begun to hum like a throat deciding whether to scream. The refinery clawed at the sky with stacks like blackened pines. Inside, everything sweated. Pipes hammered. Condensers sang in wet, exhausted notes. The deeper they went, the older the air felt, until the taste of it was all coins and old rain. Red-robed tech priests beat the steps ahead with incense and auspex poles, counting sacrilege in clicks. A servoskull hummed at her shoulder with a casket cradled in its spine, the artifact gleaming through a sliver of open lid as if it thought light was an invitation. Do not let it out of your sight, Mugos Calyx 9 said from within a walker that clung to the shaft wall like a corroded spider. His voice braided 3 tones together into something that sounded like a prayer caught in a turbine. Better, do not let it out of your philosophy. I'm not bringing it, Samus said. The key refuses the lock? He sounded delighted. Adorable, It listens when I don't touch it, she said. That's enough. They reached the chamber because the miners had stopped there. They hadn't put up warning signs. They'd put up offerings, bolts arranged into crude wings, candles made from stolen refinery wax, a child's toy car set carefully on its side as if sleeping. In the center of the floor, the rock wasn't rock anymore. It had been melted and then convinced to be solid by hands that thought geometry was a personality. A hairline seemed traced a shape no one with kind instincts would draw. The casket thrummed. Even closed, the knife inside sang to the door, and the door tried to sing back. Calyx 9's lens dilated until it was nearly a pupil. Ah, he breathed. It remembers us. It remembers something, Samus said. Her visor sketched stress lines on the world and showed her how the seam wanted to open, how it craved curves where the universe preferred lines. The suit whispered old Chozo warnings in the back of her ear. A door is not a place. It is an argument. Win before you knock. Report. Vorn voxed. Her words carried the percussion of artillery in their bones. The surface holds, barely. Malphas is moving pieces I don't like the names of. If the door opens, this moon is a statistic. Samus planted her boots and lifted her cannon. She did not open the casket. She did not touch the knife. She painted the seam with a net of charged particles fine enough to shame a spider. The air grew heavy. The seam tried to be curve again. She made it a line and then made the line thinner and then made it a memory of a line. Something on the other side pressed back. It had patience and teeth. It showed her a corridor washed in clean light and a ship that smelled like home. It offered silence without war. It tried to speak in a voice she trusted, a voice that had told her when to run, when to stop, when to survive. Adam almost only softer. I'm not bargaining, she said, and the thing behind the seam learned a new word, no. She changed beams. The missile she fired hit the ceiling. 20 meters of angry geology decided to be floor all at once. Calyx 9's walker took the weight and screamed like a hymn being bent into a different key. Escaterius went under a slab and did not get back up. The other stared at Samus through lenses powdered with dust, hand making a small, confused sign in the air that tried to be thanks. When the thunder stopped, the seam lay buried under new history. The casket in the servoskull's cradle had gone quiet, as if sulking. Status, Vorn asked, voice thin with distance and strain. We closed the choice, Samus said. Good, Vorn answered, and the word sounded like blood wiped off a blade so it could be used again. Then climb. We are not done choosing. Calyx 9 unhooked himself from the shattered walker and scuttled down the debris, mechatendrils flexing like the legs of a patient animal. He looked at the collapsed chamber with affection. Crude, he said. Dishonest. Efficient. I approve. Samus checked the readouts, willed her pulse to settle, and looked up the tunnel where the light swung like a pendulum. The war waited. The storm above had not learned humility. She started climbing, and the servoskull followed, the casket cradled like a secret that would not stay kept. They climbed into a world that smelled like cordite and hot rain. The storm gnawed the horizon in purple breaths, but the immediate sky was a lid of smoke tacked in place by searchlights and tracer fire. The demon engine lay where it fell, cooling like a mountain that had changed its mind. Crewmen in ash-gray coats swarmed its carcass with mag clamps and cautionary prayers. The Eldar silhouette on the ridge was gone as if it had been an arithmetic error the landscape corrected. Inquisitor Vorn waited at the foot of the ramp in a haze of incense and vox chatter. She regarded Samus the way a locksmith looks at a door from the wrong side, and the way a general looks at a bridge she needs more than she distrusts. You made a choice, she said without preamble. I prefer allies who do that without being asked. I didn't have a word for what that seam was turning into, Samus said. Door isn't right. Mouth isn't enough. Vorn's gaze flicked to the servoskull hovering at Samus's shoulder with the casket slung beneath it. Sometimes the name is irrelevant. We're obliged to survive it regardless. She pivoted on the steel heel of her boot. Inside, the war will keep. The Magna locomotive swallowed them with a sigh of hydraulics. The Basilica's nave had become a triage of machines. Altar mechanisms spilled open for surgery, cogitators chanting ticks like rosary beads, Scutarii standing statue-still and bleeding in neat lines down their vambraces. Tech priests drifted like tall red ghosts between them, trailing mechadendrites that wrote corrections in the air. Muggos Calyx, 9 awaited on a dais of cable and prayer scrolls, rebuilt into a new exoskeleton that whispered with every breath. His lens irised open, drinking Samus in. Marvel. Catastrophe. Iteration. You did not use the key, you became the locksmith. My jealousy is theological. I won't be dissected to make you feel better, Samus said mildly, and the cannon's hum deepened by a degree. Calyx 9's threefold voice clucked, a sound like a reluctant concession. I will accept a scan. I will accept 10 scans. I will pretend that satisfies me. Vorn stepped onto the dais and placed a hand on the casket as if to steady it, or to make sure it remembered whose table it sat on. Here is the bargain, she said. You keep your autonomy. We keep our world. You will not be caged or carved. You will be measured within limits that I set and you approve. In exchange, we ask for what you already intend to give, your interference in the plans of a man named Malphas, and a portion of whatever understanding you harvest from that thing. Samus watched the Inquisitor's mouth while she spoke. There was steel and there was economy and there was a fatigue that never asked to be pitted. If your limits creep, I walk, Samus said. If you walk, I hunt, Vorn said, and the honesty of it made the air ring. They shook hands like warriors negotiating weather. Calyx, 9 gestured and a lattice of lumen lines unfolded from the ceiling, forming a haze around Samus's suit. It tingled like soda water on old scars. Chozo glyphs budded like frost in the corners of her vision. Caution icons considering the situation and then deciding it was annoying but not an existential insult. The lattice painted a wireframe of her in the air. The cannons throwed a bright knot of equations. The power plant to contain storm. The Chozo biotechnical seems gleaming like sutures on a living god. Your machine sings in counterpoint, Calyx, 9 whispered. 2 melodies. 1 biological, 1 martial. The harmony is not legal in any score I possess. The casket thrummed as if wounded by neglect. The Muggos snapped a mechadendrite and the lid folded back a fraction by habit more than permission. Samus felt the air change, the way a room shifts when someone decides to say a hard thing aloud. The knife drank light. It looked less like a blade now and more like a wedge of a geometry no longer manufactured in this universe. Chozo curves, Eldar filigree, Necron angles like verdicts. The sight of it scraped her teeth. Do not touch it, Calyx 9 said to everyone in the room and mostly to himself. Let us ask first. Vorn's Vox earpiece crackled. She tilted her head, listening to a ledger of incoming disasters. Make it brief. Calyx 9 extended a spider-fine filament from a mechadendrite and let it hover a hair's breadth above the knife. The filament sang, not audibly but in the bones. The wireframe of Samus's suit in the air trembled in sympathy. Her HUD filled with question marks that wanted to be exclamation points and couldn't decide which would be more accurate. Resonance. The Muggos murmured. It hears you. It not hears. It remembers you and is embarrassed not to remember you better. He turned the lens toward Samus, the gesture so close to human curiosity it felt indecent on a frame of brass. It will integrate. Samus felt the suggestion like cold water on hot metal. Integration possible, the suit had whispered. Risk unknown. She could imagine its song inside the suit's chorus, a new instrument that insisted it had always been there. The part of her that loved tools like friends warmed to the idea. The part that had watched too many things become weapons without consent went cold again. What does Malphas want with this? She asked, still watching the blade. Calyx 9's mechadendrites drew a symbol in incense smoke. A seed. Plant it in a sanctum, water with blood, reap a god door. Or a gate that thinks it is a god. The Eldar would call it a cauterizer for a wound this sector cannot survive. The Necrons, if they bothered with words, would call it obvious. And you? She asked the Inquisitor. Vorn's mouth thinned. I call it leverage. A choice we can steal from him. If we are lucky, a stopgap. If we are honest, a temptation that will rot us if we cradle it too long. Samus darted her gaze to the wireframe projection and back. I sealed one seam. That bought us time. How much? Vorn listened to her vox again, brow tightening as if someone had demanded change for a coin that didn't exist. Hours, she said. Perhaps less. Malphas has begun pulling cathedrals on treads across the flats. He means to crush the refinery and anchor a ritual under the bones. She pointed to a plotscape littered with crimson pins and ugly Gothic names. Here, here, and here. We can bleed him on approach, but he will arrive. When he does, I intend to be rude. A shadow fell across the dais, heavy as a judgment. Brother Captain Valens stood at the base of the steps like a problem that had decided to introduce itself. His armor was cleaned already. The blood had been wiped with the kind of care that reads as contempt. He did not look at the knife. He looked at Samus as if looking at anything else would be polite and therefore wrong. You will not carry that abomination into the Emperor's light, he said, and his voice made the candles shake. I wasn't going to, Samus said. It follows me without being carried, and it doesn't care about your light. The Emperor's light cares about it, Valens countered. And about you. Inquisitor, your asset is a question with a blade in it. I do not like questions. You would dislike answers more, Vorn said evenly. This one keeps us alive. You may dislike her later when it is safe to indulge your aesthetics. Valens's jaw worked like a gate deciding whether to stick. He inclined his head a fraction toward Vorn out of obedience and toward Samus out of something more complicated. You fight like a heretic who has not yet been given the chance to be faithful, he said, which might have been praise, or a sentence awaiting an executioner. I fight like myself, Samus said. The basilica heaved as if remembering it was also a vehicle and wanted to demonstrate. Voxes screamed. A cherub servitor swung too hard on its cable and crashed into a column, showering prayer scrolls like molting feathers. Calyx, 9 didn't flinch. He was a piece of the machine and enjoyed being hit by his own pulse. Vorn turned away from the casket and snapped orders that ricocheted through the nave. Skirmish line at the east gate. We cede nothing we can steal back and nothing we cannot set on fire. Mechanicus, load the macrolasers. Templars, you have your bastion. Do not confuse zeal with a plan, brother captain. Samus, your talent is moving through problems other people stand under. I need you in the slag fields ahead of the refinery. Cut their advance into pieces small enough to sweep. If you find a priest of Malphas, bury him with the breath still in his chest. Samus nodded and the suit translated the intent into a recalibration that made the whole world feel half a degree closer. She glanced once more at the knife. It lay quiet in its velvet like guilt pretending to sleep. Keep it locked, she said. I would weld it to the sun if I could, Vorn said, and then softer, to no one in particular. And then I would interrogate the sun. They moved. The east gate yawned like a wound rimmed in iron. Air rushed out of it with the smell of hot metal and old prayers. The storm chewed the horizon down to a purple rind. The first of Malphas's mobile cathedrals hove into view, flanked by armor that had been loved by cruelty and maintained by fear. Its towers sprouted speakers that vomited hymns written backward. Its prow bore an icon that made the eye slip. The ground remembered to shake. Valens fell into step beside Samus as if his feet had been trained to that rhythm since vows were nails driven through skin. He spared no glances for the civilians pushing carts of ammunition like pennants, or for the Scutarii adjusting their optics with trembling, sacred patience. Do not run ahead of your allies, he said, which was a reasonable tactical suggestion wrapped in a command, then wrapped in insult for warmth. Keep up, Samus said, and the gold of her visor held the cathedral shape until the shape blinked. They went over the wall like arguments. Jump packs roared. Grapple lines sang. The flats opened their mouth to receive them and for once did not try to bite the tongue off. In the slag fields the heat came up from beneath in waves that made straight lines writhe. Samus used them, letting Mirage break her silhouette into shards that were hard to shoot. She stitched charged shots into the axles of low, angry tanks and let their tracks argue themselves off. She burned a hole through an icon that had been carefully blessed to withstand everything but the kind of light she carried. The Black Templars hit like a chorus that only knew the refrain and loved it better for not knowing the verses. Valens planted his blade in the prow of a demon-touched personnel carrier and opened it like bad fruit. Men came out screaming prayers, and he corrected their pronunciation with steel. A voice like cold honey poured into her ear across Vox channels she had not opened. "You are punctual for someone who does not like being invited," it said, tasting the shape of her name without saying it. "Malphas," she said, because there was no profit in pretending not to know the host of the party that wanted to eat her. "I have been building a door since before you were a rumor," he said, amiable in the way of storms that think they are conversations. "It requires a hinge. You are a hinge. Come be useful." "Already am," she said, and shot the legs from under a walking pulpit that had been bellowing exhortations at a frequency that turned stomachs. It crashed and spilled a priest in filigreed armor onto his face. She webbed his hands to the ground with molten slag and left him to pray into the dirt. Valens landed hard beside her, armor clanging in a way that felt like punctuation. He had a cut on his cheek, and the blood there looked shocked to be out. He followed her gaze toward the cathedral. "We break the flanks, then the spine," he said. "If you run for the head, it will cut itself off and grow 3 more. "I was thinking kneecaps," she said. "Good," he grunted. "Kneecaps are honest. They move together without meaning to, a geometry imposed by necessity and learned by body sooner than brain." She baited fire she could outrun. He put himself in the way of fire no one could. She burned holes where physics was susceptible to humiliation. He turned miracles into meat. Between them, the mobile cathedral slowed and then hesitated, as if remembering shame. Vorn's voice came thin and fierce. "Progress noted. Secondary column approaching from the south. We will be pincered if we do not pivot. Samus, I need a knife where I don't have one. Brother Captain, keep her alive long enough to be rude." Samus felt the suit run 1,000 paths and settle on one that tasted like the edge of a coin. She looked south. Heat haze hid a procession of smaller engines dragging a sculpture that looked like a god with the face sanded off. Cultists walked beside it barefoot on hot metal, smiling because the pain was a good teacher. That sculpture would be an anchor if it reached the refinery's bones. "On it," she said. Valens rolled his shoulder as if the armor were a stubborn animal he had forgiven too often. "We will argue about your existence later," he said, and leapt, a black arc over a field of problems that wanted to be solved by simpler men. Samus ran. The slag fields parted under her like a dirty curtain. Somewhere behind her, the casket in the basilica lay quiet and pretended to sleep. Somewhere ahead, Malphas waited with a patience that insulted hubris by mimicking it perfectly. The storm above folded itself tighter, making the world small and brightly lit at the edges like a stage. She smiled inside the helmet where no one could see and where the suit could keep the gesture to itself. She would not be a hinge. She would be a fracture the door could not use. The southern approach announced itself with heat and singing. Not the good kind. The procession dragged a sculpture on skids of black iron that squealed like animals. It had the outline of a god whose face had been filed down until belief could project anything onto it. Men and women walked barefoot on the hot rails, grinning because pain simplified choices. Vox-amplified choirs sang a hymn that flipped inside out every third stanza, like a snake teaching itself to tie knots. Samus dropped into a run that was more negotiation than sprint, feet making treaties with slag that wanted to behave like water. Valens arced away to the east with a pack of Templars howling oaths, all hard consonants and jet exhaust. She let their noise be a curtain and cut behind it, low, fast, cannon humming a lullaby for bad structures. The first shot took a traction engine in the knee, if engines had knees. It slewed and plowed a trench in its own escort. The second kissed a hymn speaker and turned it into honest scrap, cutting the frequency that had been making stomachs clench. The third stitched a line of heat across the anchor's foreplate, etching a seam where some artificer had swaggered and said there would never be one. A shape uncoiled from under the skids, a man in armor that looked like the inside of a mouth, bayonet teeth sprouting from every joint, cables like veins drinking from the altar's base. His helm was a snarling mask. His eyes inside it were calm. He raised a staff topped by a flayed hand holding a book, and reading it would have been a theological mistake. "Pilgrims," he said, and the vox carried his voice like rotten perfume. "The stranger hunts. Let your blood teach her manners. The pilgrims came, laughing and crying, which here were the same emotion. Samus didn't waste missiles on bodies someone else had already rented to their god. Diffusion fire flowered around her hands, concussive pulses that knocked people off their feet without emptying them of themselves. She moved through them like weather, and where she passed, the smile broke and breath returned, and a few eyes went from worship to wonder as if waking from a good dream is the worst kind of betrayal. The sorcerer, no other word fit, drew a shape in the smoke that behaved as if it had been written on glass. The shape rotated and grew teeth. The ground between them thinned until it was a rumor. Her visor stuttered and caught the fall before it began. Warnings bracketed the world. The suit whispered a Chozo proverb about walking on rivers that had forgot their jobs. A new tone threaded the air. Too clean for this place. A spear of blue etched the sorcerer's glyph into straight lines and then into a memory. On a slag ridge, the Eldar farcer lowered her stave. The crystal spinner above it hummed like a throat finishing a prayer and being satisfied with its pronunciation. Samus didn't bow, she used the breath to run. She fired a web of charged shots into the anchor's undercarriage and rolled into morph ball mid-stride. Momentum, a religion her suit had always believed. She dropped a ribbon of bombs along the skids, each a heartbeat apart, each a promise. The line sang up, shuddering the idol. Cultists threw themselves under it as if their spines had been designed for this day. The idol skated a meter left, still moving, still hungry. The sorcerer swung his staff and the bombs hiccuped, then died, fizzled like bad jokes told to wrong crowds. He smiled without moving his mouth. "Not all your little stars shine here, Hunter," he said, bitter affection in the last word. Vorn's voice knifed through the Vox din so clean it threw a shadow. "Asset, you will cut that anchor off its priests and bury it under enough slag to make a second moon, or I will promote you to liability." "On it," Samus said, though the math on the board insisted she owed someone an apology later. Calyx 9's voice, bright with ideas he shouldn't love so much, slid into a side channel. "The artifact resonates across distance. Your suit is an instrument. I can tune it from here without installing the knife. You will feel a new harmony. Dislike it, but use it." "I walk if you try to install anything," Samus said, already agreeing to more than her words meant. "Install is a vulgarity," the Muggos purred. "I will suggest." The suggestion arrived as a sensation like a new tooth growing, not painful, simply pressurized, insisting. Her HUD blinked. The seam maps she'd seen under the refinery rewrote themselves as vectors on the ground. The idol's base lit in thin ghost lines that showed where it trusted the world and where it lied. She smiled despite everything. Trust was a hinge. Hinges break. She jumped. Grapple fired and bit a rusted derrick, swung her in under the idol's forward edge. The heat there was a living thing. She planted 4 super missiles on the anchor points Calyx 9's tuning suggested, rotated and used her cannon as a jack, a piston, a denial. Power thrummed up from the suit's core, a low growl she felt in teeth and nails. She shoved. The base bucked. The pilgrims screamed praise and confusion at the same time. The sorcerer stabbed his staff into the plates and drew another impossible shape that looked like a ladder someone had set on fire before finishing it. Valens came in from the blind side like a wall learning a hobby. His blade hit the staff and pushed the ladder back into unreality. The impact ruined grammar for a radius of 10 meters. He said nothing. He didn't have to. He had a face that did work. "Break the knees," he snarled, in case anyone within earshot thought art was the assignment. "I have knees," she said, and detonated the missiles. The anchor dropped. It hung for a second, then wrenched crooked, a child's drawing of a god tilted on a bad nail. The song from the speakers slurred, lost key, found a smaller god who didn't mind being out of tune. Warp pressure hissed like opening a valve into a sea made of knives. The sorcerer roared a syllable that made the air ache. The idol didn't explode. It inhaled. The hole it made in the world pulled toward its center, drawing heat and light and prayers. The pilgrims went to their knees as if the floor had developed affection for them and wanted them closer. Samus dug her boots into grit. Her suit bristled, then flowed. Calyx 9's tuning made a new path, sliding the pulling force off her like rain on good oil. It still grabbed, but it was a hand closing on a mirror, slipping. "Hunter," Malphas breathed in her ear, affectionate as a butcher. "You arrive at every hinge. It's almost etiquette." "Learn a new metaphor," she said, and overcharged, the beam becoming a white thread she sewed through the idol's throat. She wrapped the thread around a flaw the new harmony painted for her and cinched. Metal turned to thoughts and fled. The idol came apart into 6 big loyalties and 100 bad ideas. The sucking stopped because the mouth had remembered how to choke. Something still came through. Not a full demon engine with Baroque humor and bad taste. A smaller hate with too many knees. It scrabbled out of the ruin like an idea not ready for publication. It went for the nearest warm thing, and found Valens because he had made himself the tallest candle. He met it with the casual competence of a man whose day has already handed him its thesis. The relic blade bit deep. Purple lightning crawled up the runes and turned into smoke that smelled like rain become tired. The creature screamed with hands and mouths. He pinned it against a shattered plate. Samus stepped in and made the rest of the argument with 3 shots that sewed the head to the floor through a heart the biology textbooks here refused to illustrate. The field exhaled. For a heartbeat there was quiet. Then the southern column remembered it had brought friends, and guns made their cases in a language that didn't require consent. Samus looked up. On the ridge, the farcer remained, her stave low, scrying wheels painting pale geometries on the air. A line of Eldar guardians flickered into visibility along the skyline. Fired, and were not there between blinks. The sorcerer, mask cracked, handbook twitching on the staff, staggered back, dragging rights that looked injured. He threw her a gesture that promised they would continue this correspondence. He vanished into smoke that felt opinionated. Vorn's voice returned, all calculus. Anchor neutralized. "Complicated," Samus said, because the idol had given up on being itself, but the ground where it died was learning a new habit and she didn't like the taste of it. "Complicated is better than undone," Vorn said. "Pivot north-northeast. Primary engine advances on the refinery. I require the enemy to regret momentum." Valens wiped his blade clean because it was a devotion and because the act made his kills real. He looked at Samus while the blood smoked. "You saved pilgrims who would have bled you without a thought." "I didn't do it for their thoughts," she said. "I did it because I get to choose who I become, not the war." He made a sound that might have been approval stripped of decoration. Then he turned and barked orders that moved men like faith was good logistics. Samus took 3 long breaths and let the suit steal 2 for later. The new harmony muttered to itself in her bones. It wanted to keep singing. She told it to hum in the back of the throat and not make eye contact. It obeyed, sullenly. A flicker at the edge of her visor. An icon that had slept since she fell through the sky. Ship signal. For an instant, the world tunneled down to a narrow corridor with a familiar hum at the far end. She opened the channel and got a sound like wind negotiating with static. A syllable threaded through it. Her name, almost, or someone else's bearing resemblance. Then the storm slammed a door and the icon went dark, as if embarrassed to have tried. Calyx. 9 intruded with delight he didn't attempt to hide. "Did you feel the phase slip? Your machine sang with the artifact without being devoured by it. I propose further suggestions." "Merely suggestions." "Later," she said. "Right now I need to be rude to a cathedral." "A pity," he sighed. "Rudeness is theology here." The Eldar descended not by walking but by deciding to be lower. The farcer approached with the quality of a thought you've been avoiding that finally taps your shoulder. Up close, her armor was not leaf-like. It was the idea of a leaf remembered by someone who loved knives. The helm's islets were black and polite. "You are teaching their storm to mispronounce your name," she said, voice like glass negotiating sunlight. "I'm teaching their machines to fall down," Samus said, not looking away from the refinery, where the primary engine was indeed regretting its choices too slowly. "It is the same lesson said with different vowels," the farcer replied. She extended a gloved hand and something small lay there, a stone the color of empty sky with a hair-fine crack through its heart. A soul catch. "It will not save you. It will make your choices echo less cruelly. Wear it inside your machine where songs collect." Samus took it because refusing gifts had a way of being a different sort of vow. The stone felt warm from someone else's memory. "Why help me?" she asked. "Because a coin spins, and sometimes the side it falls on is shaped by the breath of a stranger," the farcer said. "Because your arrival was not an accident, but neither was it a plan. Because Malphas is a mirror, and you do not need more of yourself yet." "Helpful," Samus said dryly. The helm tilted, the Eldar version of a smile that hated being seen. "Humans require plain speech and drown in it. Move, hunter. Your Inquisitor is trying to build a myth out of you, and myths sour if left on altars too long." Samus tucked the stone under a plate at her throat. The suit noted it, considered its opinion, and allowed it to sit in the chorus like a new instrument that wouldn't get a solo. She launched, grapples singing. Valens paced her across the flats, black and white and inevitable as punctuation. Above them the storm tightened again, a fist testing fingers. They hit the primary engine like a question that had remembered it was also an answer. Samus went low into heat and teeth. Valens went high into banners and bad math. The macro lasers on the Magna locomotive spun up a hymn of their own and carved straight lines across purple noon. Vorn's orders cut and were obeyed. Calyx, 9 laughed in 3 voices at a data spike that looked like a secret deciding to be public. The refinery breathed in steel and exhaled a vow. Malphas returned to her ear, each word a finger tapping on glass. "Door or hinge, it hardly matters. You will still turn when asked." Samus burned a hole in the engine's flank that had once been a chapel and climbed through a scream someone had nailed to a wall. Inside, the world beat like a throat. She set bombs in the places the new harmony painted in cautious blue and did not count to 3 before she ran. The engine lurched. A bell inside it tolled. It fell like a building thinking of better floors. When she climbed out of it, covered in ash that smelled like old candles and new fear, Valens was there with his blade planted in the ground and his breath writing small ghosts in the hot wind. He regarded her from a world he had sworn to, and for a moment they were 2 things that could imagine not being enemies later. "Keep moving," he said, a kindness hidden inside an order. She did. The refinery towered, scratched at the clouds as if asking for another kind. Somewhere inside it, the tunnel she'd collapsed remembered being doors and resented being rocks. Somewhere behind her, pilgrims tried to decide what to do with the intact parts of their hearts. Somewhere above, the craft world watched like a witness determined to be helpful and honest and leaving before dessert. Samus ran toward the next problem as if it had been hers all along. The new harmony hummed quietly, resentful and ready. The soulstone warmed her collarbone once, like an animal adjusting in its sleep. The storm leaned down, curious and hungry. She showed it her back and kept going. The refinery's bones groaned like a tired animal. Wind pushed smoke in clotted gusts across the flats, and the storm flexed its purple fingers as if counting how many lives it could afford to crush and still feel righteous. Vorn's orders threaded the chaos, moving armor and men as if she were playing a hymn book upside down and making it work anyway. Samus and Valens cut their way back to the east gate ahead of a countercharge that decided halfway through it preferred to be a retreat. The macro lasers carved white lanes across the gloom, and the mobile cathedral died properly this time, like a theater collapsing during the applause. Inside the basilica, the casket sat where they had left it, which somehow felt worse than if it had sprouted legs and wandered. Calyx 9 had grafted himself into a new harness, a many-need scaffold that let him stalk around his dais with the pleasure of a spider in a freshly webbed doorway. He watched Samus come in as if the door had been built for that moment. "I have mapped echoes in the substrata," he sang, 3 voices tugging at the same leash. Not one wound under the refinery. A lattice. Your earlier cautery collapsed a node. The remaining threads will reroute unless we burn the geometry at the nexus. We must go deeper. Vorn stood over a tactical table whose surface was bone-white and unforgiving. She didn't look up. "Malphas is regrouping. If he pushes now with half his strength, he breaks something I cannot afford to replace. We buy our time where it is cheapest, below." Her eyes lifted to Samus at last. "You with the Muggos and a spear of Skitarii. Valens holds the line. The Eldar hover like vultures that have learned manners and are bored of them." Valens's contempt for being left behind sharpened into obedience because obedience was the shape of his contempt. "If you die under there," he said to Samus without heat, "I will be annoyed." "I'll try to be inconsiderate elsewhere," she said, and the visor kept the brief smile like a secret between friends who denied being friends. They went down by way of an access shaft that had never existed on any sanctioned schematic. Calyx 9's mechadendrites played the servo-locks like mournful flutes. Air congealed into old coins again, then into the taste of rain that never made it to ground. Lumen globes wobbled on their stalks. Shadows clung to the walls in shapes that remembered having names. The Scutarii moved like patient metronomes, each step small, perfect, unwilling to be more interesting than necessary. The first chamber they entered could not decide if it was stone or thought. Veins of alien metal threaded the rock in curves that did not meet any standard of civic honesty. Samus's HUD lit with the same thin blue ghost lines Calyx's tuning had taught her to love against her will. The suit hummed to itself, the new harmony settling a little deeper into the chorus. The soulstone at her throat warmed like a small animal dreaming. Calyx 9 forgot how to whisper. Prelapsarian. Pre-imperial. Pre-everything I have receipts for. Chozo curves, yes, but braided with Eldar filigree and Necron angles that make mathematicians repent. It is a sewing machine for reality. They put it here as if the universe were a wound they meant to stitch closed. Samus ran a gauntlet across a seam that wasn't a seam until her visor told it to be one. It sang up under her palm without sound, a feeling like stepping on a board and finding a nail. "And the warp learned to lick the thread," she said. They moved along galleries where machines sat like extinct animals, their ribs open for autopsies that had never been finished. Here and there, candles guttered in niches. Miners had left them when they decided fear was a kind of labor they couldn't afford. The deeper they went, the more the lattice revealed of itself. Junctions hummed in the bones. Vorn's voice came and went through static like a banker sprinting between burning accounts, counting coins that kept trying to be snakes. At the nexus, the architecture stopped pretending it had been built by human hands. The chamber was a bowl punched into the world, its walls etched with lines so fine they looked like dust until you let them into your eyes. In the middle, the floor had split and not healed, a star-shaped wound whose angles tried to refuse Euclid out of principle. Everything pressed toward it, the weight of the earth, the arithmetic of the ceiling, the patience of the storm above. The casket thrummed from a servo-skull's cradle. Calyx 9's harness leaned. Hungry. "We must tune the machine to itself," he said. "It was meant to cauterize. The blade is the setting it forgot." Samus watched the star wound breathe. It exhaled cold, not air but the idea of subtraction. When she looked too long, the room showed her corridors that had never been carved through rock. For an instant, she saw a clean deck and a pilot chair, the hum of a ship she knew so well her bones had memorized the key. The sound cut out when the storm above turned in its sleep. She felt the ache the way an old scar predicts rain. "I won't slot the knife into my suit," she said, because saying it made the line real. "You can sing at it. I'll decide what the song becomes." Calyx 9's lens dilated. "Acceptably insolent," he said, and set about the work of suggesting. Lines of light unfolded around her like a cage that wanted to be a halo. The harmony climbed 2 steps and then 1 more. Her cannon's throat filled with a new pressure that made her jaw ache. The HUD's ghost lines brightened, tracing not just the weakest points of the wound but the ones most honest, the places where cutting would not simply force stress elsewhere but teach the whole structure a better habit. The soulstone warmed to match, humming under the skin at her clavicle. For a heartbeat she felt not alone. A choir existed, and she knew her note. The warp noticed. It came not with a scream but with a kindness large enough to be insulting. The air gentled. Heat faded to memory. A man's voice, remembered from a life that had taught her to survive by saying no to it, spoke into the helmet without using radios. "You have done enough, Samus. Stand down. I will take it from here." The name was almost Adam's and almost the Chozo word for child and almost the thing she had called herself when the world was a planet of ice and fear. She stepped forward and set the cannon at full draw. "No," she said, and fired a seam of white through the star. The room bucked. Scutarii went to one knee, reciting half-prayers they could not finish because the words kept picking up extra teeth. Calyx, 9 flung his mechadendrites wide and became a brace, keeping the ceiling interested in remaining a ceiling. The beam stitched, then stalled as if the fabric refused to admit it had been threadbare. The wound fought, and when it understood it wasn't winning, it stopped being clever and started being honest. Images came, Zebe's burning, a hatchling reaching for the visor with a trust that had undone every vow she thought permanent. Ridley's laugh, which was not a sound but a gravity. They were arranged carefully, like traps in an old forest. The soulstone warmed until it was almost heat, until the memory under her sternum had to decide whether to ache or to be steel. She walked through them as if wading through a river that wanted to be blood and failed at the last minute. "Hold your instrument steady, Calyx," 9 gasped, human for once by accident. "The geometry is wide. We must make it narrow." Above, voices collided on the Vox. Valens barked orders whose edges were kind and pretended not to be. Vorn said numbers the way some people said prayers. Macro lasers fired until the world outside strobed like a bad dream trying to be theater. The chamber wanted to be elsewhere. Samus kept it here with effort that felt like biting through her own tongue and smiling. The wound shrank into itself and concentrated. It revealed a core like a glass bead with a storm trapped in it. She would have had to ruin a lot of metaphors to describe it. The suit painted it in blue and told her, quietly, that if she destroyed that bead the lattice would collapse inward and the pressure would equalize and the refinery above would either survive or learn how to be sky very quickly. Calyx, 9 felt it too. His lens glowed with a joy that would have gotten him killed on any world that had leisure for such things. "This is the knot," he said, breathing greed. "Pull and the skein will." The skein resisted being a metaphor. It convulsed. The floor under Samus tried to decide it was vertical. The beam wavered. Her shoulder locked to keep her bones honest. The suit screamed in her ears and then scolded itself for being undignified. She saw what the bead would cost if she did it the way the tool demanded. An overload that would spend the energy her suit hoarded for living, a brief godhood that was mostly voltage, and then evacuation into whatever came after empty. "We can reroute load," Calyx, 9 babbled. "We can bleed into the Basilica's capacitor arrays through the Vox-mast relay. It will be loud and immoral, and I will be forgiven in songs I write myself." "Do it," she said, and felt the new harmony lean as if bracing a door no one wanted closed but everyone needed shut. The chamber filled with a second light, clean and cool, the color of the space between stars when your eyes have adjusted to joy. The Eldar stepped out of a shadow they had convinced to be a doorway. Guardians took the perimeter as if they had always lived there. The farcer walked to the edge of the star's mouth and did not fall because falling would have been a discourtesy to geometry. "Walk with the grain," she said, as if she had been narrating this moment in a language only the future understood. "You are trying to cut new wood with old habit. The skein resists not because you are wrong, but because you are impatient." "I don't have time to be patient," Samus said, and taste of metal rose again in her mouth. "That is why I brought you time," the farcer said, and lifted her stave. The crystal at its crown spun once, twice, carried on its own courage. The soulstone at Samus's throat answered like a bell across snow. The new harmony surged, not louder but truer. The blue ghost lines snapped into a tighter grid. "Calyx." 9 shouted something joyous and blasphemous in the same breath. Samus shifted her stance. The beam narrowed until it was not a beam but a line, then a thread, then a needle. She sewed. Not slashing, not burning, not forcing the wound to pretend it wasn't hurt. She stitched it closed along paths the chamber had been waiting for since before the miners set their first ladder. The bead trembled, then flowed, then became something else. Not gone, but organized, like grief remembered without lying. The backlash came anyway. It always does. Energy cracked up her arm and tried to learn her name from the inside. The overload warning folded into a whisper that did not ask permission. "Calyx." 9 held triumph and horror together as the Basilica's capacitors took a flood that would make historians angry for centuries. Somewhere above, Vorn ordered men off platforms seconds before they vaporized, then reminded herself to be angry later that she'd had to guess right. The floor jumped. The ceiling remembered it owed her a favor and held. The wound closed into a smooth scar, then into a memory of a scar, then into rock that pretended it had always been whole. Silence fell like a verdict too exhausted to be cruel. Samus took a step. Her legs pretended to be floor. The suit locked out, protecting what it could from what it had just done. The visor dimmed, then went black at the edges, then argued its way back to a narrow, useful tunnel of vision. The soulstone cooled until it was simply warm again, polite as it had been before. Calyx. 9 stood trembling in his harness, mechadendrites drooping like the arms of a man who had carried his god around the block and needed a chair. Exquisite, he breathed, every voice threadbare with joy. Excessive. Inexcusable. I will write a book about this crime. The farcer regarded the sealed floor the way a surgeon studies a scar that healed better than expected. It will hold, she said. For now. His hands are already on the next weave. He will pull elsewhere. Then we cut him short, Samus said, and took another step that cost her more than admitting it would have. The world tilted in a way the body understands before the mind. She heard Vorn on the Vox saying her name with a steadiness that had bled to achieve itself. She heard Valens suturing panic with profanities that could be explained as liturgical if questioned hard enough. She heard Calyx 9's exultant, awful laugh. She heard the farcer sigh as if someone had insisted on being mortal in public again. She went down to one knee because the floor had opinions and she was too polite to argue without facts. The farcer's hand was suddenly under her elbow, impossibly strong for something that had started as a gesture. Eldar guardians ghosted closer and retreated with choreography that made modesty look like high math. Your machine will sleep if you let it, the farcer said. You have spent rage and light. Come away before Malphas finds this moment with his teeth. I'm not done, Samus said, which was true in every way and at least one that didn't matter yet. You will be more done if you insist on being heroic in front of people who write reports, the farcer said, and for the first time she sounded almost amused. Calyx. 9 scuttled forward with a cable snaking from his harness to the casket's servo cradle. I can stabilize load from here, he announced, theatrical in his humility. The Basilica will stop hating me when the number of sparks returns to conventional. Take her. The Inquisitor will swear and then make a note and then pretend it was her idea. Samus looked at the sealed scar. The chamber no longer seemed to breathe. The blue lines faded to a quiet hum in her peripheral vision. The suit loosened its bite on her muscles by a fraction, enough to let her admit the tremble that had been there the whole time. Go, Vorn said into the Vox, as if she had been standing at their shoulders all along. If the Xenos steals you, I will claim salvage when you are returned and then pretend it was a diplomatic arrangement. Brother Captain, hold. Muggos, live. Asset, don't make me invent a saint to explain your death. I have other paperwork. Valens's reply was a short laugh carved from iron. If she dies, it will be elsewhere. I have sworn at her too recently to allow it. The farcer didn't ask permission. A seam unfolded behind her where there had been wall. It didn't look like the warp's mouth. It looked like a hallway someone had been too elegant to finish drawing. She guided Samus through with a hand that did not push and did not let go. The world turned sideways into hush. Air smelled of old resin and orchards that had been sung into being rather than planted. Lights glowed like thoughts that had decided to be seen. She heard a choir somewhere far away and then closer, voices too precise to be young and too brave to be old. Her suit let go by degrees, offended but practical. The soulstone at her throat seemed content in a way that felt unreasonably contagious. She woke to a ceiling that curved like a sail and to the whisper of machines that did not resent being named. Her helmet had lifted away. Her hair stuck to her skin along a line where condensation had traced a river. A shape stood at the foot of the couch that had decided to be her bed. Leaf knife armor. Helm set aside. A face like a blade made by someone who loved hands. You are not an accident, the farcer said, and the craft around her hummed agreement. You were pulled through a seam because the warp learned your outline and still could not fit its teeth around you. Malphas is building a door with your shadow. If you remain only yourself, you will lose. If you become what you are pretending not to be, you might teach this galaxy a new word. Samus sat up. Her limbs obeyed because embarrassment is a better stimulant than pride, and because the suit had chosen this moment to be gracious. Outside the arched window, a curvature of stars flowed past like quiet water. Structures drifted, grown rather than assembled, graceful as regret turned into discipline. What word? She asked, because the question mattered even if the answer didn't yet. Balance, the farcer said. And the price of carrying it. Samus looked down at her hands. They were steady because they had run out of tremble. She looked back up. Tell me the part you think I won't like, she said. The farcer smiled with the sadness of someone who has already read the end of every book in the room. That both the Imperium and Chaos will try to make you a saint. And that I will help neither of them succeed. The craft was alive in a way that didn't need proof. Walls curved like bones taught to remember wind. Floors were not laid but grown. Light moved as if it had been asked to be kind and agreed. Samus sat with her boots set on something that felt like memory made physical and watched the faint pulse under the wraithbone surface. The way nerves show themselves when you're tired enough to see them. The suit had stopped sulking. It listened, wary. The stone at her throat was warm the way a friend's hand is warm when they have been waiting too long and would never admit it. The farcer poured water from a vessel that did not pour so much as offer. She had removed her helm. Her face was made for decision and for grief, as if both had been hobbies she'd grown bored of and now did only to keep her hands busy. We call this place Iondon, she said, almost as if telling a story to a child she didn't want to frighten. It is a ship and a city and a cemetery and a promise. We will let you have the first two today. What kind of promise? Samus asked. The kind we pay for, the farcer said, and let the question rest where it had been set. Walk with me. They moved through galleries that would have been halls on a human craft and were instead decisions here. Shapes the size of buildings slept in niches, their surfaces too smooth to be metal and too precise to be stone. Samus knew what they were by the way the air changed around them. Engines without heat, hearts without blood. Wraithbone. The suit scans kept trying to name it and then erasing the attempt, embarrassed. Eldar passed them in pairs, in trios, none alone. They seemed to weigh less than humans did. Their eyes didn't avoid Samus. They looked through her like she was an accurate rumor. A warlock with runes tattooed along his throat paused and touched 2 fingers to the stone at her clavicle without touching it, like a blessing that didn't presume. It is noisy where you have been, he said, almost apologetic, and drifted on. The farcer led her to a window that was not an opening so much as a thinning of the ship's attention. Beyond, the craft world's curve swept past in gardens hung on nothing, in towers grown like antlers, in bridges that spanned not distances but arguments. Space lay beyond in the taut silence that follows applause. You arrive with a question, the farcer said. I will give you an answer and a better question. I was pulled, Samus said. You said that. You were shaped, the farcer said. Pulled would be our word for when we are not in control. Shaped is a kinder lie. The warp is a sea that eats ships and makes gods out of storms. It learned your outline. It cannot digest you the way it digests men who think believing is the same thing as being right. So it imitated you. Malphas carries an imitation of your will into his mouth and calls it a gate. Samus looked at her hands. The suit made them enough larger than they were that it was easy to pretend the difference was muscle and not the shape of her life. The artifact, she said. The knife. It recognized my suit. Yours recognized it first, the farcer said. Your machine was built by people who loved you enough to risk what they were for you. So was ours. The knife is a concordance grown in the places our kinds of love once overlapped. If you plant it in a sanctum and feed it blood, it will open a door that is not a door. If you hum to it along the right lines, it closes wounds geography has no words for. Both of these are true. One of these will cost you everything and leave you empty. The other will cost you everything and leave you a little. Good odds, Samus said. Deadpan because the alternatives were worse. An Eldar with hair the color of sand after rain stepped out of a side passage, looked Samus up and down with the frankness of someone who had never been misunderstood and didn't mind if today was the day. Autarch Varial, she said by way of introduction without giving it time to be awkward. I do not like guests who are also catastrophes. But I am told you are the kind of catastrophe we can put on a chart and predict. That is almost polite. I've been called worse, Samus said. You will be, Variel said, satisfied, and glanced at the farcer. The humans are writing liturgy around her face. Vorn is clever and tired. She will do the wrong thing on purpose for the right reason. Of course she will, the farcer said, as if they were discussing a maintenance schedule. She turned back to Samus. Do you wish to see our dead? Samus blinked at the simplicity of the sentence. Then she said, yes, because refusing also felt like a vow she didn't understand. They went down, not in levels but in quiet. The air changed the way a room does when a conversation has learned it matters. The chamber at the journey's end was not lit. It simply did not hide from light. Wraithbone grew in towers like petrified smoke, each strand threaded with points of faint luminescence that pulsed not in unison but in sympathy. There were no walls. There was a boundary, and it was being respected by everything that understood the word. This is our infinity circuit, the farcer said. When an Eldar dies, their soul does not feed the warp if we can help it. We catch it. We place it here. We ask it to help, and it does because it loves us and because it remembers fear and because the alternative is to be eaten. We have been avoiding appetites for a very long time. The stone at Samus's throat hummed like bees drunk on cloud light. Her HUD softened its angles. The new harmony settled into something that felt almost bearable. For a heartbeat, she thought she felt a presence that was not any of the people in the room and not any of the enemies in the sky. It was like a hand on a shoulder and like a choir singing behind a closed door. It did not ask to be trusted. It did not promise anything. It existed. That was enough. The farcer touched the tower's surface. Wraithbone rose around her fingers like tide convinced by a new moon. We can add a brace to your machine, she said. Not an integration. An honesty. The stone will buffer what you must sing. The suit will carry you where you are not supposed to stand without becoming an altar to the wrong god. You will dislike its voice when you are angry. That will be useful. What's the price? Samus asked, because everything had one and pretending otherwise was a child's game. You will feel more, the farcer said. You will know when you cut a door that tears are being shed for it somewhere. You will not be able to say later that you did not think about the hinges. And when you manage balance, it will not feel like victory. It will feel like sleep you do not wake from all at once. Samus thought of the miner's offerings in the dark. Bolt wings, a toy car on its side like a sleeping animal. She thought of Valen's cleaning his blade because it was a habit that made the world make sense. She thought of Vorn's mouth as she made her own accounting into orders. Do it, she said. If it keeps me from becoming useful to Malphas, I will carry whatever voice it has. They worked in a room that remembered surgery had once been a sacrament. Eldar artisans brought coils of white that were not wire and plates that were not plates. They did not drill or weld. They persuaded. The suit tolerated. It did not surrender. The stone set more firmly in the collar cavity, and the lines it cast into Samus's body rearranged themselves in ways that did not insist on being understood. The new harmony stopped feeling like a second song and started feeling like an echo she could aim. While they tuned, the craft world told her a story without words. She saw a garden grown along a spine where people who had forgotten how to touch without flinching learned again. She saw a war mask mounted above a door in a way that made it a reminder rather than a warning. She saw a child, which here meant someone very old who had decided to start over, laugh at a joke no one had actually told. Look, the farcer said, and Samus's visor filled with futures the way an old aquarium fills with dust motes in diagonal afternoon light. She saw banners with her silhouette cut in metal, candles guttering in front of it. She saw a Mechanicus forge shrink her armor to schematics and try to teach the schematics to pray. She saw Valen standing between her and a firing line whose eyes were pious and whose hands were steady. She saw Malphas spread like ink through a book she cared about. She saw a moment much later where a room was full of people who had learned a new word and did not know what to do with it. They will make you a saint, the farcer said, as if narrating the weather. Vorn will do it because she must. Malphas will do it because it is useful. Saints are knives you can hold by the blade if you are willing to bleed. Be careful whose hand you prefer. I'm not a saint, Samus said. I'm a person who can shoot very straight and who is too stubborn to die on someone else's schedule. That is what a saint is to people who need one, the farcer said, without malice. It would be kinder for you if you were a monster. Then they could agree. Samus looked away from the visions before their edges could cut. What do you want from me? She asked, because the Eldar were always paying and never with coin, and she did not like taking gifts that came without a bill. I want you to remember this chamber when you are asked to be a weapon, the farcer said. And I want you to refuse at least once in a way that matters. I will not help the Imperium make you a saint. I will not help chaos make you a door. I will help you be a seamstress, because the skein is torn and none of us has enough thread. Silence took a breath between them. The Wraithbone sighed in that language which sometimes speaks when no one is listening on purpose. Samus nodded. It felt like setting a piece in a lock she had not built and knowing it fit. Alarms in Eldar voices are not the same as human alarms. They are less honest and more useful. Sound threaded the chamber, too precise to be panic and too urgent to be vanity. Variel appeared as if she had been waiting just outside the moment and had enjoyed the timing too much to waste it. Your Inquisitor is burning myth, she said to Samus. The miners chant a name they do not know how to pronounce. The Black Templars have stopped killing long enough to kneel. Malphas pushes where your scar is still warm. Choose a path. If we remain kindly, we will be late. Send me back, Samus said. You are not healthy enough to be stupid, the farcer observed, affectionate and pitiless. Very well. They brought her to a place that was not a hangar, where craft waited like thoughts held between tongue and teeth. A pilot with eyes like sunlight on cold water nodded once and opened a skin of space where a door would have been on a human ship. The suit settled around Samus as if it had been standing just behind her this whole time and only pretended surprise. The new brace hummed almost invisibly in the chorus. The stone at her throat cooled in the way of things that are about to be busy. The farcer rested her palm on Samus's shoulder plate, light as if remembering a touch from a time before armor. When Vorn uses you, ask her how many men she intends to break with your shape. When Valens threatens you, ask him which vow he breaks to do it. When Malphas flatters you, ask him which part of you he imitates. Ask me nothing. I will lie only when it is efficient, but I will still lie. I appreciate honesty about lying, Samus said. It is our most endearing vice, the farcer said, and closed her eyes for a heartbeat. The ship shivered. A seam in air widened. Iyanden became smaller and brighter and then not visible at all. They dropped into a sky that had not remembered it was allowed to be blue. Purple held the edges. Smoke held everything else. The Magna locomotive crawled across the flats like a cathedral that had decided to survive out of spite. The east gate bristled with guns and prayer. Banners Samus had not authorized. Rough canvas painted with a gold visor and an arm cannon, hung from rails where laundry would have been in a sane city. Someone had carved Iron Saint into an armor plate and circled it with crude halos. Vorn had a Vox in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and the cigarette made her look like someone who had promised herself she would quit once the galaxy was less on fire. Samus landed at the foot of the ramp, and the crowd did the thing humans do when lightning hits very close and does not kill anyone. It made a sound that started in the throat and tried to become law. Valens was a black shape on the bastion, helmet under his arm, mouth tight with emotion he wouldn't have recognized as relief if you had painted it on a wall. Calyx. Nine leaned so far out over the dais his mechadendrites held him up like the legs of a heron pretending not to be surprised. Vorn threw the cigarette into a puddle that hissed as if it had opinions. She walked down 2 steps and stopped where a leader should stop to make everyone feel like they had been approached without being indulged. You look worse, she said, which in her language might have meant welcome back. I learned, Samus said. Good, Vorn said. We are behind. Malphas pushes the north edge with something we do not yet have a rude word big enough to name. Also, congratulations. The miners have given you a title. I will use it until it becomes inconvenient. Then I will invent a better one. Her gaze flicked to the new seam lines in Samus's armor, to the way light behaved differently where the brace lay under plates. The Xenos installed an idea in you. They gave me a buffer against being useful to our mutual enemy, Samus said. You're welcome. I'm a generous woman, Vorn said dryly. I would have said thank you anyway. Valens arrived, an avalanche of duty that had stopped killing long enough to walk. He took in the banners without moving his eyes. Saints don't bleed, he said. They do, Samus said. They just do it politely. He grunted agreement he didn't want to be seen making. His gaze ticked to the stone at her throat, to the more patient pulse under the armor. He didn't ask questions because questions were soft and this was not the hour for soft. We move, he said. You and I will disagree about almost everything. We will do it after we ruin a plan. Deal, Samus said and looked to Vorn. North, Vorn said. Cut the ritual circle at the 3 points I am marking. Calyx. 9 will keep the basilica from becoming a lightning rod. The Eldar will appear when they can insult us with their timing most effectively. Calyx. 9 coughed a laugh into the vox. I will catch the sparks. Try not to reinvent fire without me. Samus turned. The storm leaned down like a parent determined to be disappointed. On the horizon, lines of metal too ornate to be honest moved with choreographed hunger. Between them, pilgrim crowds surged, eyes shining with a light that had not originated in their heads. The new harmony in the suit rose, steady, ready to be asked. The stone at her throat warmed once, as if a choir had taken a breath. She ran. The banners snapped behind her in wind that smelled like salt and welding and incense burned by hands that needed somewhere to put their hope. Someone shouted her new name. She didn't turn. She had a better one and it didn't need a wall to hang on. The first cut went clean. Samus ran the beam along the chalked earth like a seamstress who had decided the pattern was a lie, and the ritual circle buckled as if embarrassed. Valens took the second point with the blunt honesty of a relic blade and a prayer shouted too close to the edge of hearing. The third anchor tried to be clever, sinking into the slag and pretending to be geology, but she could feel the new brace humming at her throat like a tuning fork held to a skull. The lines it painted on her HUD traced the circle's true outline under the filth. She knelt and stitched light through stone until the ground decided to be floor again. When it was done, the storm sagged for the length of a held breath. Voxes that had only known screaming for an hour remembered how to report. Vorn's voice cut through, flensed of ceremony. Good. Back to the gate. We will pretend this counts as momentum. They ran the long road under a sky that looked like a wound healing wrong. The East Bastion had become a shrine by accident. Candles guttered in wind that should have put them out and didn't. Someone had hoisted a canvas with her visor painted in ochre. Crude halo smudged around it by thumbs too dirty for sacrament. The word Iron Saint had acquired serifs and admiration. A child in a stained habhood made a two-handed sign that was probably meant for the Emperor and wouldn't mind sharing. Vorn met her at the ramp as if she had never moved. Smoke from a new cigarette spelling a private alphabet in the air. Your legend works on people who need sleep more than instructions, she said. I have let it exist. It will get them onto walls they would not climb otherwise. It will get them off those walls when I tell them to run. That is all the theology I can afford. You could have asked, Samus said, and the visor hid the expression the voice made unnecessary. I could have, Vorn said, unbothered. And if I had, you would have told me no. I have a world to pay for. I will spend what spends. You included. Behind them, Calyx 9's dais had become a golden cage. The Muggos stalked within it on a scaffold of legs and tubes, bright as greed. Racks of frames had been rolled out and draped in prayer cloths like corpses at a decent wake. He twitched a mechadendrite and revealed the first of them with a flourish, a sarcophagus of sainted metal budding with sockets and ports, a human outline implied within like an accusation. Pattern designation, he crooned in 3 voices. State Route 00 Iron Litanies. Inspired only by admiration. Clad only in obedience. It will take the unaugmented human and make of them a hymn. The Chozo curves are not copied. The Eldar filigrees are not stolen. I have listened. Listening is legal. Samus stepped closer. The frame hummed at a frequency her bones disapproved of. Her suit picked up a trace from the brace she wore now, the wraith bone echoing thinly in the machine's skeleton. You took my scans. I requested them of reality, and reality was generous, Calyx said, delighted at the joke. There is no theft. There is synthesis. The Imperium may not have saints, but it can have saint patterns. Your legend is a machine I can manufacture. She looked at the sockets, at the ritual needles meant to root into a soldier's spine, at the inscription plates where a name would be engraved in case someone needed somewhere to grieve. How many die before one lives? She asked. Fewer if we begin now, Calyx said, and the honesty of it made him sound humane by mistake. Vorn didn't blink. I did not approve deployment, she said. Prototypes remain prototypes. They will not remain anything if I do not feed them men, Calyx said. The war is a mouth. We must decide which teeth it wears. Valenza's bootfalls announced him before the shadow did. He took in the frame without stepping closer. His lip curled the way a man's does when he smells rot and knows he will still eat. Heretic architecture wearing a hymn, he said softly. You will put this on boys who call you father. I will put this on volunteers who call me savior, Calyx 9 said, without shame. If the Inquisitor allows me to write the proper litanies first. Samus reached out and touched the frame's outer edge with 2 fingers. The brace in her suit flinched. The stone at her throat warmed until it felt like a pulse that didn't belong to her. She took her hand away. Turned them off. Vorn stared at the racks as if they had insulted her by existing before she could decide how to hate them. A long exhale. Muggos, she said, each syllable weighed and taxed. You will put this work to paper and lock the paper behind 3 doors. You will not install so much as a devotional screw without my word. If I find a single pilgrim wired into a prototype, I will take your lens as a tithe. Calyx 9's amusement thinned to a wire. You are paying in time, he said. Your ledger will not balance. It never has, Vorn said. Consider it a tradition. Valenza's gaze slid to Samus. There was an understanding there, brittle and reluctant. If they cage you, he said, I will break the cage. If you become the thing they fear you are, I will break you. That is the vow I can keep without lying. Useful, Samus said. Be there when you're needed. They left the frames to their dreams. Outside, Grailfor tried to decide what color its day was. Pick screens built from scrap and faith displayed a loop of her silhouette cutting a demon engine's throat, played back with the lag of bad wiring and enthusiasm. A preacher on a broken cargo crate told the crowd that the Iron Saint had arrived because the Emperor had finally found a machine worthy of loving. Vorn let it go on 2 sentences longer than she tolerated, then cut the feed with a flick of her wrist and replaced it with maps. The crowd did not riot. They rearranged their hopes. Northwest, Vorn said. Malphas pulls back and in. He is not routed. He is gathering. He will open his mouth where we cannot put a wall. We take what hours we can and then we leave the surface. We go into the storm. The word we fell into the room like a bolt counting heads. Valenza's jaw tightened. Calyx 9 swayed with delight. Somewhere a vox clicked twice. Eldar punctuation drifting into human channels like pollen. Samus slept in the corner of the nave because there was nowhere else to put the kind of exhaustion that came without sleep. The suit dimmed to a vigil. The new harmony hummed like a generator behind a wall. She dreamed of nothing which qualified as mercy. She woke to bells that had not been installed, to atone the refinery learned from something above it. The basilica shook in a way too regular to be impact and too patient to be earthquake. Vorn's vox tore itself hoarse. Positions. Macro batteries do not target the phenomenon. You will not hit it and you will make it worse. Scutarii bleed but do it in formation. Templars stop being art. Be a door. Samus ran for the gate. The sky had stopped pretending to be weather. It peeled back like skin under a clinician's hands and revealed light with teeth. A circle opened over the flats, not cut but coaxed, its edge crawling with script the size of towers. Malphas's voice rolled out of it across channels that had never existed before, each syllable a touch on a bruise. Come, he said, and the words slid into the basilica, into lungs, into places that had no business receiving visitors. You have stitched so neatly. Come unpick with me. Valens studied the hole as if it had asked for a duel, and he was insulted by its etiquette. "We cannot hold this," he said, for once wasting breath on truth. "We weren't going to," Vorn said, arriving with her coat thrown on like a challenge. "We were going to be rude inside his house until he leaves ours alone." "Calyx." 9 vibrated. "Yes. Yes. Yes. We have a map of the seams under structure. The basilica's capacitors are charged to criminal levels. If we enter at the right vector with an asset that can hum in tune." Samus looked up into the wound in the day. It was not metaphysics to her. It was a problem with an edge. She felt the brace warm, the stone answer, the suit set its teeth. "I'll go." Valens didn't argue. He only stepped forward and stood at her shoulder as if the next sentence might try to move her, and his body existed to refute grammar. "My chaplain will write a complaint," he said, deadpan. "I will take it under advisement." "The Eldar will be there," a voice said without taking the trouble to introduce itself. The farcer's shape unfolded from nobody's shadow. Guardians ghosted into existence along the ramparts in a way that made men of faith reconsider how tightly they held their definitions. "We will not bless your plan. We will make it less fatal." Vorn flicked ash off a cigarette that had not survived her last moment of weakness. "If you have advice, give it before I spend people." "Do not take the knife into your bones," the farcer said to Samus. "Carry it at your side. Let it see, not speak. Your machine will be enough if you allow it to be exactly what it is." "Calyx." 9 fidgeted with all the parts of himself that could fidget. "I can tune her to the seam from here and bleed off the excess into the macro grid. The basilica will not enjoy it." "It never enjoys anything," Vorn said. "It will survive. Unlike us if we are polite." The crowd pressed behind the cordon, faces upturned, hope raw enough to do harm. Someone reached through and touched the greave of Samus's boot with fingertips that wanted blessing and would take steel. For an instant she considered saluting the banners with her stolen name. She didn't. She found a mechanic's boy with oil on his face and pressed a hand onto his shoulder through the bars. "Hold fast when they tell you to run," she said. "And run when they tell you to hold. Don't be a hero. Let me be inconvenient for you." He nodded as if she had given him law. Valens watched the exchange and looked away like a man who had been offered tenderness and had no pocket for it. "If you lose yourself," he said softly, "too low for anyone else, I will find you in there and break whatever has hold of you. If it is you, I will still try." "I would want you to," she said. "They armed for blasphemy." Calyx 9 produced a housing like a scabbard made of math. The knife lay within, sullen, a sliver of concordance wrapped in wraithbone script that had learned to be a leash. Samus took it, and the suit begrudged it a place at her hip. The stone at her throat cooled, which here meant assent. The new harmony gathered like breath before speech. The world narrowed to a ramp, to a drop, to a mouth in the sky that tasted of old iron and new promises. Vorn stood at the base of the ramp, looking up as if judging a deal she was about to be forced to sign. "If you do not return," she said, "I will lie about you so well you will be angry in whatever afterlife you choose." "Good," Samus said. "Give them something beautiful to be wrong about." The farcer placed 2 fingers above the soulstone, not touching. "You are not a hinge," she murmured. "You are a weight. Use it." Valens sealed his helm. The last thing she saw of his face was a line at the corner of the mouth that might become a smile in a different century. "On your mark," he said. Samus stepped off the world. The storm met her with hands full of hooks and, for once, found no purchase. The brace sang. The suit set its jaw. The knife at her side watched like a dangerous witness. The circle's edge rose to meet them, script crawling like ants convinced they were a language. She angled into the wound the way you might angle into a rip current, not fighting the drag so much as agreeing with it at the right moments. Behind her, the Magna locomotive's capacitors screamed as Calyx 9 fed sin into circuits. Vorn's voice counted down in a tone reserved for executions. The Eldar's stave drew a straight line in a place that did not believe in them. The world went white, then purple, then thin. They fell inward. The storm wasn't weather there. It was argument. It offered her mercy in shapes she had learned to distrust. It showed her doors with names she had worn once. It held up a mirror. On the other side, Malphas waited, smiling with a face that looked too much like hers to be an accident. "Saint," he said, gentle as catastrophe. "Shall we pray?" The prayer he offered was a joke in a language that hurt to hear. The warp made a cathedral around his smile, ribs arcing up out of the knot ground in curves that pretended they had always been there. Candles burned with cold fire. Choirs sleeved in nothing sang without mouths. He wore her face the way a thief wears a priest's robe, convincing until you looked at the hands. They were too clean. They had not picked up a friend and carried them out of fire. They had not held a hatchling that trusted. Samus kept her cannon between them like the answer to a question she had refused to admit existed. The brace hummed, the stone at her throat pulsed once, and the suit settled its weight as if bracing against gravity it had decided to invent. Valens landed at her right with a thunder that had learned to whisper. The Eldar unfolded along a line that wasn't a line until they agreed it was. Calyx 9's voice came thin and bright from a place that might have been a radio and might have been a thought with good acoustics. Vorn's tone threaded all of it like a red string. "Count, cut, count again." "You're not a god," Samus said to the mirror. "You're a habit with a costume." "And you are a refusal wearing a suit," Malphas said, her mouth moving around words she hadn't chosen and making them sound better than they deserved. "I am what the warp learned of you when you taught it hunger was not enough. You close doors. I open them. We are the same tool presented to different hands." He stepped forward and the cathedral leaned. As if the building wanted to be a shadow, he walked in. Behind him, figures the size of towers moved. Demon engines pared down to the idea of cruelty, all joints and mouths and scripture written backward. The sky was a wound held open by will and teeth. The mouth of the rift yawned above with script crawling its lip like ants who thought they were alphabets. Valens lifted his blade, and the litanies engraved along it lit word by word, as if remembering that belief burns. "No tool chooses the hand," he said. "But this one bites." The first clash was not steel on steel. It was words on truth. Oaths went off like grenades. Samus felt Valens's vow hit the air and make it a little less likely to lie. Eldar runes spun and intersected, drawing geometry in a place that did not believe in anything except appetite. Calyx 9 fed the Basilica's capacitor banks into a tether that grabbed Samus's waist and called a home. Somewhere far away, the Magna locomotive screamed like a choir being asked to change key too quickly. Vorn counted down to things no one else could see and stopped counting at 0 because 0 is a faith. Malphas lifted a hand with her knuckles, her tendons, her scars improved into aesthetics, and the cathedral breathed in. Gravity learned new tricks and applied them with the earnestness of a student who wanted to please. The ground peeled up under Samus as if it had been told to be a wall. She jumped before the thought finished, grapple biting a rib, cannon discharging a white thread of light that sewed two pieces of unreality together until they forgot they had ever been separate. The mirror smiled, pleased with the execution of a problem he had designed for her. "See. Hinge," he said, affectionate. "Turn for me." She fired a super missile past him into the basin of the cathedral floor. It hit not stone but an argument, and the argument went quiet where her new harmony told it to. The whole structure slumped, annoyed. Valens took the moment and became a black line through a demon engine's throat. The thing writhed, rest wrung itself on oaths it had stolen, and died with a noise like liturgy being eaten. Guardians flickered and shot in disciplined bursts, their bright lances stitching lace into the shadows. The farcer moved her stave like a fountain pen signing a treaty with physics. Every time Malphas reached for a path, she shortened it by a heartbeat, and timing is a kind of blade. Skitarii filed forward 2 ranks deep and chanted Benharic litanies that sounded like rain falling on a metal roof in perfect time, their galvanic rifles writing punctuation marks where things tried to grow sentences. Samus kept moving because stopping here would mean believing the floor was anything but a suggestion. The stone under her collar hummed when she overreached, softened her aim into something truer. She used it, hated it a little, used it more. A demon thing with 5 knees leapt for her visor. She met it with a point-blank diffusion burst that turned its doctrines into steam. The suit took the splash and made it someone else's memory. Malphas came through his machines, through her. Smiling with patience crippled into condescension. "You don't have to be alone," he said, and for a heartbeat the warp sounded kind. He walked through images that rose at his sides like donors in a good church. Zebes unburned. A hatchling alive and asleep on her arm cannon. Breatha metronome. A deck washed in clean light and a pilot chair waiting. Adam's voice doing what it always did, telling her how to live. She did not shoot the ghosts. She shot the space between them, sewing their edges together until they fused into one harmless thing. A pane of glass, a mirror. She let herself see herself and did not look away. The soulstone pulsed agreement, a choir behind a wall. "You copy," she said. Breath steady only because the suit argued with her nerves. "You're good at it. But you're still a copy. I'm the seamstress." He laughed, and all the mouths of the engines laughed with him until the cathedral rang. Then he stopped, and the silence felt like a hand closing on a throat. "You think you are more than your pattern," he said softly. "But patterns are what survive." He moved. It wasn't speed. It was authorial control. One instant he was 100 meters away. The next he was close enough for her visor to paint reflection on his eyes. He touched the wraithbone scabbard at her hip with gentle fingers. "Give me the knife," he whispered, like an older sibling asking to borrow trouble. "I will make you whole." Samus drove her knee into his midsection and was unsurprised when the physics of the strike did not oblige. He slid back anyway because she needed him to. Valens interposed without announcing his intent, blade coming down in a two-handed stroke meant to bisect problems regardless of pretense. Malphas caught it with a palm and the oath fire along its edge sputtered like candles in a draft. He looked down in mild interest. "Faith is the shape of fear wearing armor," he said. Valens leaned into the lock, teeth bared behind his helm. "So is your god," he said, and the blade shoved a millimeter deeper on contempt alone. The basilica's tether yanked, hard enough to make Samus's teeth click. "Calyx," 9 shouted, delighted and afraid and bored of the distinction. "The vector wobbles. The seam is, learning. Continue being obscene. I will keep the books." "Keep them in order," Vorn said between reports, "or I will turn you into one." The rift above convulsed and vomited architecture. Towers growing out of bridges eating themselves, stairs that climbed into hands. The battlefield rearranged moment to moment as arguments were won and lost. Samus used it. She ran where Malphas assumed she would stand, stood where he was certain she would run. Every time he called her saint, she did something rude. Every time he called her hinge, she made herself a weight and dragged something down. He stopped pretending to be amused. One by one, the copies of her face he wore lost their polish. He borrowed her anger and wore it badly. The engines came tighter, forming a ring with too many sides. The choir changed key to a frequency that tried to thicken blood. The farcer flicked her stave and the sound broke into discrete parts, manageable because they had been named. "Samus," she said without moving her mouth. "He is not a person. He is a lesson. Do not be a student." "Working on it," Samus said, and felt the knife in its scabbard wake up like an animal smelling blood. Her visor filled with 1,000 blue ghost lines that wanted to be seams in Malphas himself. The new harmony sang. The soulstone refused to let it become a scream. She could cut him. She could cut him, and maybe that would be enough. Or maybe it would be exactly the door he wanted. He saw the decision on her and smiled. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes." She closed her fist around the scabbard and kept the knife sheathed. "No," she said, and twisted instead. The beam she fired laced through the ring of engines and missed every heart on purpose. It stitched the space between them into a mesh, taught the cathedral its own balance, turned every maw into an anchor that held its neighbor to stillness. Malphas reached to undo it and found he could not do it fast enough. Valens pushed him then, not back but sideways, into a geometry that did not want him. He staggered for the first time with her weight on him. Her refusal, her balance, things he did not model well because they didn't look heroic. Now, Calyx 9 gasped, numbers spilling out of him like oil. Now. Samus jumped. Grapples bit a rib that had not existed a heartbeat before. She swung feet first into Malfa's and through him, because the place where he had agreed to be solid was a courtesy she did not accept. As she passed, she tore the laughter from his mouth, stitched it shut with a white thread until it couldn't find enough vowels to be cruel. He clawed at the seam with hands that didn't like the work, and the stitch held. The cathedral screamed. The engines quivered. The choir forgot their lyrics. The rift above hiccuped. The tether to the basilica dragged so hard she felt bones consider new careers. Vorn's voice became a blade. That is enough. Pull out or we lose the line. The farcer's stave rang, and guardians threw hooks of light that latched into ideas and made them temporary. Valens seized Samus by the forearm and hauled. His gauntlet left a bruise that would admit being a kindness later. Malfa's reached, not with hands but with the shape of her he wore, and almost took the scabbard. "Saint," he said, muffled, eyes furious now that they were his and not hers. "Look what you refuse. All I asked was that you be useful in a way that matters." "I am," she said, and let go of everything that wasn't the choice to leave. They went up through a tunnel of objections. The basilica's capacitors burned like a second sun in some terrible basement. Calyx. Nine laughed and begged forgiveness and promised never to do it again in the exact tone that promised he would. The Eldar painted straight lines to climb in a place that hated straight lines. Valens swore until faith became a lever. Vorn counted, then counted backwards, then stopped counting and simply held on with will the size of a city. They burst out of the hole in the sky like a prayer admitted by accident. Air returned arrogant and thin. The Magna locomotive stood with its ribs open, steam praying to nothing. The crowd that hadn't run yet saw them and made the kind of sound people make when a myth declines to die. Samus hit the ramp and went to one knee because the deck wanted to remind her she had knees. The scabbard at her hip shook once like an animal that needed to be told a thing twice. The knife inside hummed a word her suit refused to translate because it would stick. Vorn came down the steps punched full of holes and made a sentence out of herself. "Report," she said, and the fact that she took in Samus's posture, Valens's new dents, the Eldar's breathing rate, and Calyx 9's ecstatic guilt in a single glance did not make it a question. "We hurt him," Samus said. "We taught the gate to stutter. He won't pretend as much next time." Calyx 9 showed his teeth, or the brass he preferred. "The seam remembers being smaller," he said. "High on data. We can build on that memory. With enough charge and the proper blasphemies, we can make it close." The farcer looked at the scabbard and then at Samus's visor. "Or it can open inwards and swallow your outline whole. He has learned you. He will try to be you more convincingly." Valens wiped his blade on the world and sheathed it. The motions ritual and practical. "Then be less convincing," he said. "Be ugly. Be true." The storm didn't break. It turned its face away to inhale. In the distance, the ritual ground where she had cut earlier began to smoke with lines she had not cut. The air tasted like a word about to be said in anger. Men on the walls glanced at banners with a gold visor and then at her greaves and then back again, as if waiting to learn how to look at their own hope. Samus stood. The suit complained and then corrected itself. She set her palm on the scabbard and felt the knife listen. She could fuse it to the suit. She knew that now the way you know where your tongue is in your mouth. Obvious, intimate, dangerous. It would make her a door they could close with. It would make her something else after. Vorn saw it register and did not blink. "If you do it where I can spend the cost. If you refuse so hard I can build policy around it." The farcer's eyes were patient and too old for superstition. "Balance, Hunter," she said. "Carry it as far as the last door. After that, no one can advise you." Valens touched her shoulder plate with the same delicacy he'd used to check a wound without reopening it. "If it eats you," he said, "I will be rude at your funeral." She almost smiled. The knife purred in its sleep. Above them, the rift drew breath like a leviathan sick of teasing ships. Malphas's voice returned, amused again because he had decided he was. "You have chosen the long way," he said, and the storm made the words visible in the air as script that refused to hold still. "Good. It is my favorite road." Samus looked up and didn't bother to answer. She already had. She turned toward the refinery's bones, where a new seam had begun to right itself inside the scar she'd sewn. The last door waited in a place that remembered her shape too well. She started walking, the suit's chorus low and steady, the stone at her throat warm like a breath he'd never possess. The basilica groaned and followed. The Eldar shadows shifted, making room for a failure to become a plan. Valens paced beside her because his vows would not let him be anywhere else. Vorn lit a cigarette she would never finish and began doing arithmetic that ended with the words "we live." The sky lowered, bruise dark. The ground vibrated with something that had learned to love itself too much. Every step took her closer to the thing she had decided not to be and might have to become anyway. She did what she had always done. She kept moving. The last door drew itself where she had sewn the scar, as if it had memorized her handwriting and decided to forge it. The lines came back thin at first, a trembling spiderwork in a refinery's bones, then thick as convictions. The air remembered cold again. Lights on the gantries blinked in a pattern that pretended to be coincidence. Men with rifles glanced at banners that made promises they were too tired to doubt, and then made the sign that said they were allowed to be afraid and useful at the same time. Vorn stood on the ramp of the Magna locomotive with her cigarette unlit because the wind was busy being prophecy. "We are done pretending the surface matters," she said to the Vox and to the crowd and to herself. "We go under. We end it where it wanted to begin." Valens nodded once and put his helm on so no one would see the relief hardening into duty. Calyx. 9 fussed with cables like a man combing a god's hair. The farcer stood where the shadow didn't quite touch her feet and watched the lines draw themselves toward the center with the quiet of someone who had run out of metaphors on purpose. Samus touched the scabbard at her hip and felt the knife listen. The brace hummed, the stone warmed, the suit set its jaw. She looked at Vorn. "If I don't return," she said, and got as far as that. "I will write the kind of lie that makes truths possible," Vorn said, not unkind. Valens's gauntlet thumped her shoulder plate, the smallest knock on a door that didn't need knocking. "I will follow until following becomes breaking," he said. "And if I must break, I will." "Good," Samus said, because there was no better blessing available, and dropped into the refinery's throat. The descent tasted of coins and rain and the kind of quiet that happens just before pain decides to be instructive. The tunnel she had collapsed to save a city had been restless in her absence. They had learned to shift in a patient way. The seam ahead shone like a blade laid on the floor of a dark room and asked to be noticed. Skitarii set perimeters with ritual efficiency. The Eldar took positions that looked like coincidence and weren't. Calyx, 9 spread his harness wide and sank tendrils into old machinery, whispering apologies and requests in the same breath. "This is where it wanted you," the farcer said, eyes on the wound. "Do not oblige it without a price." Samus drew closer until the cold became opinion and then decision. The star-shaped mouth reopened, its angles less Euclidean than grief. Beyond it, the warp did not bother to be subtle. It bent toward her as if attracted by kindness it could finally degrade. Malphas breathed through the opening like a patient man leaning on a windowsill. "You are late," he said, wearing her mouth without the history that had earned it. "But I am patient. Doors wait." "I'm not a door," she said, not to him, to herself, to the stone, to the suit, to the room. "I am a wait." The basilica's capacitors came online far above with a groan that sounded like a choir trying to remember harmony after too long at war. Calyx 9's lens flared. Vector aligned. "The charge is criminal. The ledger will shriek. I am righteous." "Shut up and be brilliant," Vorn said, which in any other mouth would have been a compliment. Samus set the scabbard on her thigh and opened it with the gentleness you use for wild animals and old books. The knife sat in its wraithbone brace like a sliver of midnight taught manners. Chozo curves braided into Eldar filigree. Necron angles making the eye blink and apologize. Her suit tasted the air and made a sound like agreement with conditions. The stone at her throat warmed until it became the axis of her breathing. She had promised not to take it into her bones until the last door. This was that door. She took it. The blade slid into the suit's architecture with a click she felt in teeth and memory. The world narrowed and widened at once. Every seam in the chamber wrote itself in blue on her HUD and then in white under her ribs. The suit's chorus climbed, not louder, truer, as if the instrument it had always been now understood the key. The farcer's hand hovered at her shoulder without touching. The stone pulsed. Calyx 9 exhaled a sound that made old machines forgive him. Valens took one step closer for no tactical reason and all the important ones. Malphas smiled, triumphant and tender. Yes, he said, soft, like a teacher whose worst student had finally decided to be honest. At last. She fired. It wasn't a beam. It was a line being reminded of itself. It stitched through the star's mouth along paths the chamber had been missing for centuries, along arteries that had healed wrong, along stories that had been told out of order. The warp didn't scream. It argued. It offered alternatives. It promised leniency and then love and then purpose and then the intoxicating ease of being part of something larger than your own stubborn breath. She walked through every offer with the ugly grace of a person who has practiced saying no to themselves and meant it. The backlash tried to make her a saint. It lifted her, weightless, crown of white fire, visor reflecting 100 faces she could be if she surrendered the tedious chore of being singular. The crowd above would have fallen to their knees if they could see. Valens would have too for a heartbeat, and then he would have grieved and slain the idol. Vorn would have used the image like a scalpel. Malphas would have made it a nail. The stone at her throat pulsed once more, heavy, a bell in snow. The wraithbone brace anchored. The suit remembered what it had been built for. Not transcendence, but survival. The knife sang and she told it where to sit in the choir. Balance, she said, and the word became geometry. The seam fought, then learned. The chamber's lines accepted the stitch. The starmouth shrank around a bead of light like a tear held between fingers. Malphas pressed through, all patience burned to anger, and ran into the only thing the warp does not know what to do with. Refusal made beautiful. He reached with her hands to take back the blade. She met him not with force, he had more, but with weight. She put herself where the door wanted to fall. She became the thing that tips the scale when both sides are tired of arguing. The knife burned like a dawn that didn't apologize. The basilica screamed. Calyx 9 begged his capacitors to survive. Vorn told the entire city to hold and meant it for herself. The Eldar drew straight lines in a place that had never heard of them, and the lines obeyed out of shame. The bead at the seam's heart shivered and tried to be a mouth. Samus put her palm over it. The suit opened for her because this was what it had been made for, to take a hand that would not take itself away. The light went through her. Not around. Through. She saw Zebes again, and the hatchling and the ship's clean deck, and 100 lives she had not lived because one was already too many. She did not turn her head. It needed somewhere to go. Balance is not destruction. It is placement. She could blow the bead and equalize pressure with a failure that would look like victory. Or she could carry it, the way you carry a sleeping child past a room where arguments are being rehearsed. The choice felt like grief and like competence. Valens's gauntlet closed on her forearm as the ground bucked. Do not, he said, and meant 10 different do nots and loved all of them like vows. She turned her hand in his and made the smallest nod in the world. Hold the world, she said. He did. He put his boots into the floor and his voice into the vox and his blade into the air, and he held. The Black Templars at the gate knelt with rifles up and faith forward. Scutarii clicked their teeth and metronomed their fire. Calyx 9 rewired sin and made it sing in harmonic with mathematics. Vorn took her cigarette out of her mouth because ash fell into her eye and she needed both hands, and she smiled a small hook of a smile because the numbers decided, briefly, to be on her side. Samus stepped forward into the seam, carrying the bead like a heart she couldn't spare. Malphas reached too late, because he had tried to make her a tool instead of watching who she was. He shouted Saint again, and it had no teeth. The chamber stretched. The world thinned. The tunnel swallowed light and decided to be corridor. The last thing she saw of the refinery was the toy car lying on its side, soot wet, exactly where the miners had left it, a reminder that someone had intended to come back. She fell upward into a place that wasn't between so much as a side. There was no color there, only the possibility of it. Time canted, then chose not to. The suit's chorus quieted to a hum that matched the stone's pulse and the knife's long exhale. The bead cooled until it was not a bead but a seed, until it was not a seed but a weight. She held it, and it held the seam closed, and neither of them pretended to be anything they weren't. Voices came and went along a wire the world had not invented yet. Vorn's tone, hoarse and pleased and already calculating the lies she would need to tell to do the least harm. Containment achieved, she said to someone who would be promoted for writing it down. Cost pending. We live. Valence's vow, unadorned and in a register he didn't use in public. If you can hear this, return. If you cannot, stay gone well. He stood at the scar with his helmet off and did not pray because he didn't know how to ask for what he wanted. Calyx. 9. Ecstatic and grieving in equal measure. The ledger balances at a loss that proves profit. I will be insufferable. I will build altars out of equations. I will not install state route 00 without permission. He paused, scandalized by himself. Unless. The farcer, a smile in the air. Balance is a verb, she said into the place that held her friend. Thank you for doing it properly. We will teach them the word. They will hate it. They will live anyway. The crowd above built a shrine quickly because grief is a muscle and they had taught it endurance. The banner with the gold visor required candles that would never go out because someone always felt responsible for them. Children traced the letters on the canvas and learned how to spell saint without learning how to spell door. Preachers told stories that were better than true. Vorn let them, then edited the stories when they started costing lives. Time did not pass where she was. It arranged itself politely when she needed it. Once, a hum on a frequency her bones knew enough to miss threaded the not air. Her ship somewhere, continuing on orders she had not given. It felt like a promise she was not allowed to keep yet. She tucked it away like the last ration in a pocket. The bead lightened as the seam forgot it had ever been open. She didn't. The suit carried the new silent part of itself without resentment because it had been designed by love, ruthless enough to stay useful. The stone at her throat cooled. The knife slept. She might have slept. It was hard to tell. When the weight was as much memory as mass, the place that was aside put her back. Not with ceremony. With good timing. She woke on the shale flats under a sky that had learned blue again at the edges. The basilica crouched on its legs like a tired animal and forgave itself for not being beautiful. The refinery still stood, defiant and repaired incorrectly in the way heroics repair most things. Banners moved in a wind that finally remembered to care about weather instead of gods. People saw her and did not scream. They did not kneel, not most of them. One boy with oil on his face waved, shy and relieved in the same hand. Valence's breath left him in a sound that had none of the dignity he liked on him. Vorn did not light a cigarette because some moments she refused to set on fire. The last door stayed sealed. Malphas's voice did not come back, not there, not today. He would open another argument elsewhere. Men like him did. The farcer watched from a ridge that geography had not made room for and had to accommodate anyway, and she tilted her helm the barest degree, a bow without the weight of apology. Samus stood. For a moment the suit held her up because it wanted to, not because she asked. The crowd did not call her saint. They called her by a name they had learned to pronounce without blasphemy. She nodded like a person who had done a job and intended to do another. Calyx. 9 vibrated in a way that made engineers back away and promised not to touch her with anything sharp until she slept. Valens looked at her visor and saw his reflection and pretended not to recognize the expression. Vorn descended 2 steps and stopped where she always stopped, where approach could be mistaken for intimacy and wasn't. Report, she said. Closed, Samus said. Until someone is rude enough to open it again. Someone will be, Vorn said, and it hurt like humor. We will invoice them. The shrine stayed, because people needed to put candles somewhere and because even the best lies are a kind of scaffolding. But the title on the banner changed. Iron Saint became Iron Seamstress in clumsy hand, letters wobbly and proud. It was not good theology. It was better truth. That night, if it was night, She sat on the refinery roof with her boots in grit and watched the storm sulk along the horizon like a god whose appetite had been corrected. Valen stood beside her and did not speak because silence was a vow too. The farcer came and went like a thought you're grateful to have and unwilling to hold. Calyx, 9, sent a servoskull with tea and a request for 3 scans accompanied by an apology that almost sounded practiced. Vorn arranged for the miners to eat and the soldiers to sleep and the dead to have names and the living to have lies that would not break their backs. Samus touched the stone at her throat. It felt like a friend's hand again. The knife lay quiet in the scabbard. The suit breathed with her. She thought of all the doors she had closed and all the ones she had left open with intention. She would leave this world when its math no longer needed her. She would go where the next argument waited. She would not be a hinge. She would carry weight. Above, stars that had been forgotten returned to their posts. The universe did what it always does when someone does the hard, small work beautifully. It pretended not to notice and kept living. If it whispered her name, it did so where no one had to spend faith hearing it.